I'd like to welcome you all to the special session number 3, which is going to look at the security and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar's Rakhine state, a state long troubled by conflict, but from which, in the latest wave of violence, nearly 700,000, mainly Rohingya refugees, have fled in response to the military operations undertaken by the Myanmar government. Themselves, of course, a response to the deadly attacks by a Rohingya insurgency group on their number. The scale and intensity of these latest military operations have been variously described, but their effects are clear and evidenced in the sprawling camps of Cox's Bazar in neighbouring Bangladesh. Alongside the humanitarian crisis, there is, of course, as was briefly referred to in this morning's session, a geopolitical one, with concerns that the situation there risks inflaming ethnic and religious tensions across the region, straining diplomatic ties, draining precious resources of already stretched nations, and all whilst breeding further publicity and recruitment opportunity for terrorist groups. This is not to underestimate the extraordinary complexity and sensitivity of this particular issue and the partnerships that will be important in addressing them, and it is in that spirit that we are all meeting this afternoon. Prime Minister Modi, who of course opened the Shangri-La Dialogue yesterday, has, for example, referred to Myanmar as a key pillar in India's Act East policy. Furthermore, amidst all these concerns, on Thursday, we all welcomed the signing of a long-discussed memorandum of understanding between the governments of Myanmar and 2 UN organisations, the UNDP and the UNHCR, to work together on the repatriation process of refugees that might allow the voluntary, safe and dignified return of those who have been forced to flee. Now, the aim of this session is to assess both the security and humanitarian dimensions of the crisis, but it's also to consider what concrete steps are being taken and might still be taken further to ameliorate the crisis, looking for the common ground between key stakeholders in this complex set of dynamics. To help us do that, I am delighted that we are able to host the distinguished panellists that you see alongside me. Union Minister and National Security Advisor Thaung, President of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, and Political Director of the European External Action Service, Jean-Christophe Belliard. Thank you all in advance for your time and your insights. Sadly, you will notice that we are one panellist down after the Director General of Forces Intelligence from Bangladesh was sadly rushed to hospital last night. That presents a fairly reasonable excuse for a no-show today. We're of course sorry that he isn't here and wish him a speedy recovery. Before we start, remember, please, these special sections remain on the record, but they are distinguished from the plenary sessions in part by their size and the intent to promote a more open, free-flowing debate. So after the panellists have made their opening remarks, I will of course be looking forward to hearing from all of you on your thoughts, insights, questions and comments, and if you could do so in the usual way, I'll do my best to attract your attention and get you speaking as soon as possible. So thank you very much indeed, and without further ado, I would ask Thaung please to open the comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Thank you for the introductory remarks. And I'm sorry to hear that my distinguished colleague from Bangladesh has been hospitalized, and my thoughts are with him, and I wish him a very speedy recovery. Madam Chairperson, my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be back in Singapore at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue, and to join the distinguished members of this panel to discuss the security and humanitarian dimensions of the situation in Myanmar's Rakhine state. I believe these discussions are timely. The reasons are twofold. First, unless the security challenges are promptly addressed, the risks of renewed intercommunal violence will remain. The security situation in northern Rakhine deteriorated sharply following the attacks on police outposts in Maurer Township by the self-styled Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, or ASA. The subsequent clashes between the security forces and the terrorists, with the inevitable consequences of conflict, led to a significant number of Muslims seeking shelter in Bangladesh and other communities in Rakhine moving to the south. The root cause of this tragedy is terrorism. The root cause is terrorism. And terrorism cannot be condoned under any circumstance. It must be nipped in the bud. Second, with the onset of the monsoon season, there is a real danger that floods and landslides will have a disastrous effect on the camps of displaced persons. I see many in the room who are familiar with Bangladesh. My good friend, the former foreign minister of Bangladesh, is in the room, and he knows how difficult the situation is in these camps during the monsoon season. There is an urgent need to provide humanitarian assistance to all and to expedite the repatriation process agreed to by Myanmar and Bangladesh last November. While the situation in northern Rakhine has been the focus of much international attention, the narrative related to it has very sadly been incomplete and misleading. Unverified allegations have been reported as facts or gospel's truth, resulting in precipitations that aggravated the whole situation. So I'm here with you this afternoon to share my perspective based on frontline experience and observations on the ground. In the past year, I have visited the Rakhine state and the border with Bangladesh several times and have talked to various ethnic groups living over there. Myanmar has deep sympathy and concern for all the displaced persons, especially the young, the weak, and the defenseless, whoever they may be, who have been and continue to be exploited for the pernicious and ruthless strategy of terrorists. We in Myanmar are doing our utmost to repatriate the displaced people expeditiously in order to avoid yet another humanitarian disaster. Myanmar does not deny that what is unfolding in northern Rakhine is a humanitarian crisis. But it is a crisis which affects more than just one community. It presents a serious national security, and as a national security advisor, I'm concerned with the challenge to our national security, not just for Myanmar, for Bangladesh as well, and for the whole region. It is a complex challenge of enormous dimensions involving issues including, but not limited to, sovereignty, territorial integrity, rule of law, human rights, terrorism, development issues, and mass migration. The situation underscores the need for cooperation. We should have a forward-looking strategy. We must cooperate. We want to cooperate with our neighbor, Bangladesh, and with the international community as a whole. Myanmar signed an agreement with Bangladesh on 23rd November 2017 regarding the repatriation of displaced people. We have done it before, and there is no reason why we can do it again. My good friends here who know this situation, can tell us that in 78, 79, we were able to overcome similar situation. Similarly, 92, we had a similar situation. We were able to resolve it. and we can do it again. It is important to note that Myanmar, for its part, has fully abided by the term of this agreement with Bangladesh and will continue to do so, despite all efforts on the part of Myanmar to facilitate the repatriation process. It has been stalled. But there is hope. Day before yesterday, there was an agreement reached between UNHCR and UNDP and Myanmar, and we have now agreed on the text of an MOU. It will allow for UNHCR and UNDP to take part in various stages of return and resettlement and to support access to livelihood through the design and implementation of community-based projects. The cooperation will create conditions conducive to the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable repatriation of all returnees, and there will be no cap on how many people can return to Myanmar. It has also been announced that Myanmar, just as you heard from the chair, that Myanmar has decided to set up an independent commission of inquiry to address the issues of reconciliation, peace, stability, and development in Rakhine. The commission will look into various aspects of the situation in Rakhine, including the allegations of human rights violations. Unhelpful pressures is inflaming the discourse and detracting from the essential pursuit of a peaceful and diplomatic solution. Worse still, a prejudiced propaganda campaign and exploitation of the plight of refugees is being used by terrorists to achieve their aims. The current round of violence in Rakhine started in 2012, rapidly morphing from communal tensions to an issue of terrorism threatening Myanmar's national security. On August 25th last year, 30 police outposts and 1 regiment in Maurer were deliberately and systematically attacked by IISS terrorists. We are the aggrieved party. IISS has claimed responsibility for the attacks. They launched attacks to instill fear in the hearts and minds of villagers and had no qualms about using women and children as human shield. They risked the lives of thousands of villagers who were entitled to protection as innocent civilians. Many members of the Muslim community themselves have become victims and targets of the extremists. The premeditated and brutal killing of village heads and innocent civilians by IISS caused ethnic minorities to flee the area, not just the Muslims. Those ethnic groups from Ro to Kaman and everyone else had to flee the area. The situation was exacerbated as a result of an unscrupulous propaganda campaign by IISS. There is no denying that the Muslim community in Rakhine has suffered. The Buddhist Rakhine, Hindus, and other ethnic minorities have suffered no less. As you are aware, I'm sure, Amnesty International last week released a report detailing the massacre of 99 Hindus by the IISS terrorists. Myanmar calls on the international community to see the situation in Rakhine more objectively. Naming and shaming cannot help resolve this situation. It can only further inflame the current tensions in Rakhine. It is antithetical to a peaceful and durable solution of the crisis. Myanmar, in protecting its people and territory from terrorist attacks, has been severely criticized. Yet Myanmar deserves to have the same right adopted by all sovereign nations to protect citizens and communities in its own territory. We must allow the security forces of Myanmar to protect the country, but they must act within the bounds of law. They do not have a carte blanche, and rule of law must prevail. And we want to ensure the rule of law prevails in Myanmar. I thank you, and I will stop there for now. and we'll take your questions at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. It was very good to hear your comments on the humanitarian and national security aspects to the crisis, and to have your perspective, not least, of course, because it is not always easy for others to access the area that's under discussion, in the verification procedures that you rightly point out are very important. So it was good to hear your commitment to the physical return of these civilians of all ethnicities, and perhaps in the Q&A we could talk a little bit as well about, beyond the physical security, some of the other conditions that might we also be looking at following on the implementation of the recommendations of the Annan report. But for the moment now, I turn from one former experienced diplomat to another with decades of experience serving their country around the world. Peter Maurer, now president of the ICRC, an organisation that is, of course, playing a critical role in alleviating the impact of this crisis, including through the provision of food and medical services.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, for me as well, it's a great privilege to share this panel this afternoon and to bring a humanitarian perspective to the table this afternoon and some of our experiences with the crisis in Myanmar. Thanks also to IISS for inviting us to this panel. From a humanitarian perspective, the situation in Rakhine features similar characteristics to what we have seen in many other conflicts these days worldwide. Mass displacements due to multiple expressions of violence, political, military, intercommunity, and other sources, and violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. An increasingly long-term crisis in which political solutions seem elusive and humanitarian organizations are assisting a large number of beneficiaries over an increasingly long time. And short-term emergency issues compounding more structural challenges such as poverty, injustice, exclusion, lack of governance, and pushing countries and regions towards what we call increasingly the phenomenon of protracted conflict. Today in Cox's Bazar and Rakhine, the ICRC and the broader humanitarian community is very much still in relief and emergency mode, providing life-saving assistance along well-established principles and practices. In that sense, I wanted to welcome what U Thaung just mentioned a minute ago, that the Myanmar government agreed with UN agencies to have them also work in Myanmar, because for many months the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, in particular ICRC, have been the only feasible external humanitarian actors in Myanmar. So we appreciate a lot that we get company in our relief efforts. I said our focus is short-term. For instance, in Rakhine today, we are doubling the distribution of food rations so that we can help communities before the rainy season begins and many areas become inaccessible. Working with our partners, the Red Cross and the International Federation of the Red Cross, we are also running mobile health clinics and distributing emergency assistance kits. We are also working to reconnect thousands of people on both sides of the border separated by the crisis. We are focusing not only on the mitigation of violence, but our mandate also requires us to protect populations affected by the violence, by war and violence, and through the law. In this perspective, we engage in a series of activities which give us unique additional access and insight into the conflict dynamic. Such activities include visiting places of detention in Rakhine and elsewhere in Myanmar, promoting international humanitarian law to non-state armed groups, and holding a dialogue on the conduct of hostilities with the parties to the conflict, and educating armed forces on particularly delicate health issues, protecting healthcare systems and personnel, and on weapon wounded and war surgery. While it may sound obvious that we are delivering such services, nothing can be taken as granted in today's conflicts and contexts. Even basic humanitarian programs need trustful relationships with all actors and authorities. Humanitarian assistance must be delivered in a neutral and impartial way, taking into consideration the different tensions in the conflict environment. Failure to do so will further polarize the situation. In that sense, I'm glad that our long-term engagement in Myanmar and Bangladesh, with our strictly neutral, impartial and independent humanitarian approach, plus our method of confidentially raising sensitive issues with the parties, is facilitating today's crisis response. With the emergency response, while the emergency response continues, there must also be urgent progress from humanitarians, development actors, and from the authorities on building sustainable solutions. In Rakhine, before the current crisis and continuing, we are contributing to sustainable health, economic, and water activities which are in line with the recommendations of the Kofi Annan-led Rakhine Advisory Commission. We are keen to see these humanitarian recommendations politically embraced and implemented on the ground. The Annan Commission's recommendations are an especially noteworthy example of how humanitarian and political steps can and should go hand in hand. We acknowledge that political solutions are difficult, yet we also see that the current conditions of people living in the camps are untenable. We urge, therefore, that sustainable solutions are found to allow safe, dignified and voluntary returns as soon as possible. Our current understanding of the situation is that the vast majority of displaced people are not yet ready to return. Confidence to return will require not only humanitarian and mitigating activities, but also effective political steps forward. Steps towards ensuring freedom of movement, access to basic services, freedom to undertake economic activity and access to markets in Rakhine, and most importantly, trust in security arrangements for those who return. We are still far away from reuniting such ramifications today at a large scale. However, even if returns started today and followed the process and timelines laid out by Bangladesh and Myanmar, it would most likely take several years to complete. In the meantime, those living in camps in Bangladesh must be able to live in dignity and with basic services. Families cannot live in dignity over years under makeshift tents tarpaulin exposed to the monsoon. Children cannot miss years of education. The sick elderly cannot go without health care. People cannot live with constant uncertainty and without the hope of a better life. We must focus both on pragmatic, immediate measures, especially in the face of the upcoming monsoon, and to press for sustainable solutions that mean a better life for people waiting in Bangladesh and for the return to their homes. Speaking today in the heart of Asia, I cannot but emphasize the important role that this region must play in creating a conducive atmosphere and environment for a political solution for the Rakhine crisis, which must address the underlying and long-standing causes. There are displaced people and migrants from Myanmar spread throughout Asia, with many of your countries here at the table hosting people from Myanmar over decades. This audience and those on this panel in particular know well the geopolitical elements that could further complicate this crisis. With its religious, security, economic and political divides, with the alliances of interests which have been building around the Rakhine crisis, this has become one of the most internationalized and protracted conflict solutions. Engagement of the region is critical to manage further globalization of the crisis. We all know that despair and hopelessness felt by people affected by violence, if left to fester, can have terrible long-term impact on individuals, communities, and states. And we know that respect for international humanitarian law and the rule of law can contribute to better protection and to mitigate against further despair and radicalization of populations affected by crises. Let me conclude by suggesting 3 parameters to consider in order to improve both the humanitarian and the security situation. And when I mention these parameters, it is in recognition that only humanitarian perspective will not be able to solve the present crisis. It is important first to uphold the dignity of those displaced to Bangladesh and provide them the best chance of returning home with safety and dignity when conditions are right and the respect of the principle of non-refoulement. Secondly, it is important to support the government of Myanmar in full and speedy implementation of the Rakhine Advisory Commission's recommendations, spread across the 5 thematic areas of conflict prevention, humanitarian assistance, reconciliation, institution building, and development. These recommendations contain the necessary ingredients to address the security and humanitarian crisis in Rakhine. And thirdly, and at the heart of our concern at the ICRC, it is important to ensure that the security operations are conducted with full respect of the principles of international humanitarian law, do not target civilians, do not inflict unnecessary suffering, and adhere to the principles of military necessity and proportionality. I thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for those 3 very clear policy principles and for outlining ICRC's crucial role in short-term crisis management work, and for talking briefly not just about the nearly 700,000 refugees in Cox's Bazar and elsewhere, but also referencing the situation of the some 400,000 Rohingya, obviously, that still are in Rakhine state, and the conditions that they face and the challenges the Myanmar government faces there. Lastly, I am delighted to welcome Jean-Christophe Belliard, a senior French diplomat who now serves as the Deputy Secretary General for Political Affairs and Political Director in the European Union's External Action Service. The EU, of course, has been at the forefront of the international community's re-engagement with Myanmar in response to political changes there. And on a more general note, their Foreign Affairs Council earlier this week, they have committed to re-enhancing and working up EU security engagement in Asia more generally. So, Jean-Christophe Belliard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you to have the European Union in this panel, and also globally in this Shangri-La. This part of the world is very important for the European Union. We are in a moment in the European Union where we are surrounded by many crises: Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Yemen. But there are also 2 other crises, more distant, which make the headlines in Europe. A lot of emotion because of the magnitude of these 2 crises, because of the speed of these 2 crises, and this is Venezuela and this is Myanmar. In Venezuela, things are clear. There is a dictator and its people. In Myanmar, things are more complicated. There are a multitude of rebellions, a lot of fighting here and there. There is a democratic process. Elected people, the result of a free expression of the people, and at the same time, the deep state is still around. So Myanmar, like Venezuela, is fundamentally, we think in Brussels, a crisis of governance, political governance. What is the EU doing? One, humanitarian in Bangladesh for Bangladeshi and the refugees. We must not forget the Bangladeshis, the local communities inside Myanmar. And the EU and its 28 member states is contributing 50% of the world effort. And I think it is something important to mention, because at the same time, we are very involved in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, so we are facing many crises here and there. 2, we are very active in development aid. We have a significant program with Myanmar of 688 million euros. We just launched a program of 221 million euros for education and vocational training. So we are there, the links are there. And in fact, we are making a link between what we do, our program, and the recommendation of the Kofi Annan proposals we think it is very important to address the root cause of what's going on there. Basically, we are pushing for a political process to start in order to create the condition for the return, voluntary return, it has been mentioned by our colleague from ICRC, safe return of the refugees. Two, and I think we are there, maybe, I hope so, encourage the civilian government to re-establish a relation of confidence with the UN. We had the visit of the Security Council some days ago, Startergate cooperation with UNDP, HCR, Human Rights Council. We also have a new special envoy of the UN. We hope she can do her job on the ground. Our intention is to support the civilian government because we think it is the only one able to propose to solve the political crisis and to implement the democratic transition, take it to its end. At the same time, we want to reinforce pressure on the army. The EU has recently decided to reinforce its arms embargo on the army, and we have now put in place a framework for targeted measures against those military who are involved in atrocities. We have not taken sanctions, but we have the framework ready. And we also think that violation of human rights must not stay unpunished. They must not be not punished. EU has been very active in Geneva and in New York. In conclusion, it is interesting our colleague from Myanmar said it's a crisis of terrorism. I will end by saying if this crisis is not addressed, we are running the risk to have terrorism at a time, and we know what it is in Europe, where we are about, we hope, to end up with Daesh in Syria and Iraq. And when Daesh is looking for new grounds, the situation now in the camps in Bangladesh could be a very fertile ground for the possible growth of terrorism in this part of the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. There's plenty to discuss there. It is, of course, as all of our panelists have noted, a complex crisis, so that means there should be plenty of different perspectives, insights, questions and comments from the room on it, not least the final point that Jean-Christophe Belliard mentioned in terms of the dangers of this becoming more complex still with the propaganda possibilities that this provides for Islamist terrorism. I would also wonder if we could widen the discussions out a little bit in our Q&A session. We've heard a lot about ASEAN centrality so far today in the SLD, so it would be very interesting to hear a few perspectives from ASEAN nations on how ASEAN can be central in addressing the situation here. And with that, we obviously decided that our colleague from Bangladesh was irreplaceable on the panel, but we are very grateful that the ambassador from Thailand to Singapore, Ambassador Manop Chai, has kindly agreed to just say a few first comments before we open up discussions to everybody else. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. First of all, there's some positive developments in Rakhine State during the last few days. Thailand welcomes recent positive developments undertaken by the Myanmar government, i.e., a decision to establish a national-level independent commission on inquiry to address the accountability and impunity issues regarding human rights violation in Rakhine State. The inclusion of international figures as members of the commission underscores the credibility and neutrality of the work of the Commission. Second, the agreed MOU between Myanmar and UNSCR and UNDP. This MOU provides an opportunity for UNSCR and UNDP to engage in various stages of repatriation, resettlement, and provision of sustainable livelihood for the displaced person. Our current position, we believe that the root cause of the problems is related to the socio-economic conditions of Rakhine State. We view that the issues of intercommunal reconciliation or interfaith dialogues and distribution of equitable and inclusive growth for all communities should be addressed urgently. This needs to be looked at it entirely. The overall security situation on the ground seems to have gradually been stable. However, much more needs to be done. 3 immediate issues should be addressed. First, provide additional humanitarian assistance for those affected, approximately 700,000 people, especially in Cox's Bazar. Second, launch credible repatriation program which requires sincere coordination between Myanmar and Bangladesh to enable the commencement of repatriation. And third, develop a plan for long-term and sustainable socio-economic development in Rakhine State, in which the participation from the international community is very much needed. Another key issue is that the Myanmar government should work on its master plan for long-term solution and development in Rakhine. This will provide the international community the opportunity to further help Myanmar in practical and concrete terms in orchestrated and coordinated manner. To date, the Royal Thai government has contributed $1.25 million as immediate humanitarian assistance to both Myanmar and Bangladesh. For longer-term development, Thailand International Cooperation Agency, TICA, has established Thailand-Myanmar Development Cooperation Framework for a 3-year period, designed to support Myanmar in improving the living standard of the people, including those in Rakhine, which has specific focus on infrastructure, health services, community-based development, and vocational skill training. With this framework, we are now implementing the construction of a rice mill, the renovation of a shrimp cultivation center, and we will continue to expand our cooperation with our capacity in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's not often that you get to say it at these sort of events, but there seems to be a sort of remarkable atmosphere of positivism in the room on quite a difficult subject. We've clearly inherited something of what the South Korean Minister of Defence was talking about this morning. Potentially to bring us a little bit back down to earth, can I start with Richard Lloyd-Parry, please? I will collect a few questions from the floor before we return to the panel, and we'll carry on the dialogue like this.
Okay. Thank you. The Minister from Myanmar spoke of different narratives, and I think that's one way of saying that there's a very different version of events to the one he has described, and I think it's worth setting out in a bit of detail because nobody else has. From everything I have learned, what happened in Rakhine State was that last August, the Myanmar armed forces used as a pretext very small-scale attacks on some of its outposts to launch a campaign of ethnic cleansing on a staggering scale with intense brutality and cruelty. The armed forces carried out a campaign of arson, rape and murder against civilians, largely, overwhelmingly Rohingya civilians, which drove hundreds and thousands of them in terror over the border into Bangladesh. And these events have been corroborated and described in multiple and consistent witness statements from those in Bangladesh. And these accounts have been gathered and published by not only human rights organisations, international media organisations, international organisations, including UN organisations and NGOs, and deep expressions of concern about these events have been made by foreign governments. Many of these institutions that have expressed concern are ones who were deeply sympathetic and supportive of the struggle for democracy of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi before she became the leader of the government. So my question for the Myanmar minister is not whether you agree with me, because I'm sure you're not going to say that, but how do you explain the motivation of these many, many different independent international organisations who all agree that your armed forces have done something absolutely terrible in Rakhine State? Why would they all simultaneously lie in the same way? That's a question for you. For the other two members of the panel, my question is, which of these two versions of events do you believe? The one we've been told by the minister or the other one?
Thank you very much indeed. The Minister will answer, but we're going to just take a couple more questions. First of all, then next from Aaron Connolly, Research Fellow for East Asia at the Lowy Institute.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you, U Thong Thun, for coming here and speaking with us today. I know that there are many voices in Myanmar that dismiss engagement with the international community these days. I know you have not been one of those voices. I think it's important that Myanmar officials come and hear what the international community has to say, even if it's not particularly congenial to your interests. So I appreciate you coming here today. Let me ask, you spoke about the Annan Commission's report. Recommendation 31 of the Annan Commission's report was free and unfettered press access to Rakhine State. Your government is currently prosecuting 2 Reuters journalists for a report on a massacre at Indin in Rakhine State. Clearly, the Annan Commission's report's recommendations are not being implemented so long as the government is jailing journalists for reporting on war crimes that occurred in Rakhine State. Your government could very easily instruct the Attorney General to dismiss this prosecution, and the President could offer an amnesty, which he chose not to do during New Year celebrations in April. So will you take steps to ensure unfettered press access to Rakhine State by dismissing the charges against these 2 Reuters journalists?
Minister, those are 2 very direct questions. Would you like to respond straight away?
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think they deserve a response. I mean, they are well-considered questions. First, let me begin with the second one, free and unfettered access. I would like to assure you that many journalists have been allowed to go to Rakhine. The most recent one was last week when a group of Japanese journalists, accompanied by the Japanese ambassador to Myanmar, were on the ground. Additionally, those journalists based in Yangon, including writers and AP and AFP, have been to Rakhine on several occasions. And we will continue to allow access, but when you say free and unfettered access, you have to keep in mind that there are terrorists operating in this area, and we don't want to have a situation which exacerbates already difficult situation. And that is why we will allow access, but it will not be unfettered access, because if you go into territory where the ASA terrorists are operating, then additionally there's also the AA insurgent group. So we don't want to have a situation where the government is held responsible for the casualties caused by these terrorists. The other thing that I would like to assure you is that with regard to the 2 journalists, we now have a democratic transition in Myanmar. We have a democratic government that is 2 years old, and we have made sure that there will be a separation of powers. What the judiciary does, as you have suggested in your statement, you suggested that perhaps the executive could order the judiciary. That would be undemocratic. So we will allow the judiciary to proceed with the process, and when they are finished, there will be an executive decision. And I cannot prejudge what the president is going to do, but I can give you an example of these journalists who came to Myanmar, and broke the law of the land by using drones to fly over the Parliament building and do their reporting. And when the judge sentenced them to a jail sentence, they were pardoned and they were deported and let go free. So in this case, and I think the case is nearing completion, and I would urge you to be patient, and then you can then make a judgment on what the government will do. I cannot let the cat out of the bag, but please give us time, and you will see what we will do. That is what to do with journalists. The other one is that, of course, there is a different narrative, and that's what I have been telling our friends, because the airwaves have been ruled by one narrative, and this is because it has been repeated and is an emotional and emotive issue. So we believe that you ought to lend your ear to different narratives and then come to a decision. If these allegations are true, and we have time and again said there should be a judgment on this, please file FIRs, and we will provide security through the United Nations to come to Myanmar and go through the legal system. This is a government that says we value the rule of law. We would like to see them file FIRs and then tell us who and where and when these cases occurred. And if the military is found to have transgressed the rules of engagement and the standard operation procedures, and they will have action taken against them. I can give you an example that we have had 2 investigative commissions. One was led by the Vice President of Myanmar, and that was done a few months ago. And the second one is the investigation carried out by the military itself. The second investigation found a group of military personnel to have stepped the bounds, and action have been taken. They were responsible for the death of 10 prisoners, and they were given 10-year sentences. This can be verified. This is a very transparent action. Additionally, day before yesterday, we have announced to the world that we will have a 3-member inquiry panel, and they will be supported by a group of international experts. So that is our commitment to find the truth. We also would like to find the truth. Why did so many people find it necessary to abandon the hearth and homes? I have said in my statement that it was due to fear, and fear could be from different sides. But basically, the fear was sown in the hearts and minds of villagers for several years. There have been terrorist cells operating in each and every Muslim village in northern Rakhine. And they have made sure that anybody who disagreed with them would have the throat slit. And they were able to encourage women and children to join them on this attack they carried out in the early hours of 25th August. The Kofi Annan Commission came up with a report on the 24th of August. Within hours, there was an attack. This was an attempt to derail the Kofi Annan Commission's effort to find a solution. And everybody in this room will agree with me that Kofi Annan's commission is the best way forward. There are 88 recommendations. We have completed 60. We will continue to find ways and means to complete the rest. That includes access to journalists, and we will keep on doing that. I will give you a commitment of the government. Thank you for...
Just a very quick follow-up. Does the mandate of the inquiry that's been announced specifically authorise an inquiry not just into the activities of ARSA, but into the activities of the Myanmar military in response to those attacks?
I think that's a very good question. I was away from the capital when it happened. It happened day before yesterday. I had just arrived on the plane when I heard this, but I can tell you a little bit about it because I had a hand in it. So in our discussions, we agreed that it was time to have an inquiry commission. We agreed that it should be quite a compact commission. So it was 3 members, but could be supported by a group of experts. That would include legal experts from different legal systems. So we would welcome experts, but we haven't named the people. So I cannot tell you who will be on this commission. But we are ready to go beyond what we are doing now. And the mandate will be in the hands of the panel. It will not be a mandate that we will ask them to carry out. They will decide what kind of investigation they would like to do.
Very briefly, but I mean, we were asked as well, the 2 other panel members, to express ourselves on the narratives. And obviously there are two narratives. And with regard to ICRC, I mean, it's not our task to decide between the one or the other narrative. As I explained beforehand, our task is to engage with all parties to the conflict and to share our findings of violations of international humanitarian law and to entice change of behavior in doing so. That's our methodology. So I can't associate myself to one or the other narrative. It's not our task, but I wanted to reconfirm that of course, we are of the opinion that violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law has happened by all sides in that conflict, and we are engaging with all sides in order to do and to revisit those events in August in order to draw the appropriate conclusions.
Yeah, part of the answer to your question, of course, is the complexity of the political situation in this country, with, in fact, election coming soon, in 2020, and we are trying to be positive. We have the Kofi Annan proposals. We are pushing for something going on with the UN, and it is happening. But of course, it's very disturbing. 700,000 people moved just like that. And in Europe, we have the souvenir of 2 years ago, Aleppo, and last year, on this year, Eastern Ghouta, for groups of terrorists, and then the whole population has to leave. So that would be my answer.
And now, can I please turn to Iftar Ahmed Chowdhury from the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore.
Many thanks, Chair. Well, I come here with mixed feelings, really, because I'm very happy to see 2 of my very close colleagues on the panel, Thaung and Peter Maurer. Thaung, of course, I'm very pleased that he now has these ministerial responsibilities, which I'm sure he'll discharge with great capability. Peter and I have been together for many, many years in the United Nations, and Mr. Belliard, of course, I haven't worked with before, but now I have. The other reason why it's the reason for the mixed feelings is that we are gathered to speak to a subject of horrific proportions, really. I mean, I must say that what's happened and what's happening in the Rakhine state is the unfolding of a tragedy of unspeakable proportions. I can't describe it in language any better than Lloyd Parry has. It's not just the humanitarian aspects, of course, because it can also lead to the conflagration in a way that it might engulf the entire region, and that's what I think Mr. Belliard was referring to in his initial remarks. I shan't be very long, but I was just wondering that many of us around this room are familiar with a principle called the responsibility to protect, or in other words, it's also known as R2P. I shall speak off the cuff and from memory. I believe the responsibility entails the following, that it is the responsibility of every state to look after its populations. If for some reason it is either unable to or unwilling to do so, the responsibility would devolve on the international community, which, operating through the United Nations, would implement, discharge those responsibilities. Of course, it has, as all of you are aware, several steps, but there would have to be a formal decision, I should think, for the responsibility, decision to commence, to begin the implementation of this responsibility R2P. To my mind, perhaps, nothing since this responsibility was adopted, or this resolution was adopted in the year 2005, if I recall right, nothing has merits. No situation has merited the application of this principle than perhaps this one has. Of course, it would have to be done in consonance with all party, an agreement, understanding with all parties, Myanmar, of course, Bangladesh as well, perhaps the Security Council of the United Nations, which would have to get involved in any case. So this is my question to Peter, actually, though he will say that as president of Red Cross, it is not his responsibility to speak to political issues. But might I draw on his experience? And would he believe that the situation merits the consideration of the implementation of such a principle? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now to Kansuke Nagaoka, Deputy Director General in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you very much. First of all, we are very much pleased with the most recent development, namely the signing of MOU and also the establishment of Independent Inquiry Commission, as my government has made a certain contribution to that effect. It is indeed an important step forward, but nonetheless it is just the beginning. And it's very, very long way to go. And I agree with the Dr. Maurer and others that the international community will continue to support Myanmar, Bangladesh, both governments, together with the very important role to being played by ASEAN countries. I have one question about the root causes. The Myanmar minister talked about the terrorism, but the situation in Rakhine is very complex indeed, as you're all aware. We also have to look at the history of the region, ethnic relations among the different minority communities and others. We also have to be mindful of the lack of proper development in Rakhine state, as it is said that Rakhine is one of the least development regional state in the country. So my question to the minister is how to address this important challenge so that eventually both Buddhist and the Muslim communities can benefit from the fruits of the development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take one more question before we return to our panel. My eyesight is terrible, so the lady at the back is going to have to help me by introducing herself. Thank you very much.
Gwen Robinson, Chief Editor of the Nikkei Asian Review and Senior Fellow at IISS, the good IISS at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. I, like Richard Lloyd Parry, have been following Rakhine for some time and have seen the development since 2011 there. And I've also seen, I think if I could remind people in this room, there have been at least 7 inquiries, including ones by the Rakhine state government, several involving the national government, many more involving international community, but the domestic ones, including also the fairly absolutely astonishing military-backed inquiry, which completely exonerated the armed forces from any accusations of human rights abuses. So one question I have to U Thaung, and I know you've said that this will go further than previous ones, but what has happened to all these others? There has been no action or follow-up, so why would this one be any different? And secondly, to all the panellists, I'd just like to ask, in step with the increasingly urgent humanitarian efforts and reconstruction of villages, and there were nearly 300 razed to the ground in Rakhine State, and the pressure on the international community agencies to help refugees in the camps before monsoon, is also a growing push for accountability and, among some states and organisations, punishment of certain sorts, example, sanctions. I'd like to ask each panellist how useful or not useful are these kind of growing efforts for accountability. Some people are trying to make cases to take Myanmar to the ICC, in step with the focus right now on the urgent situation on the ground. So,
super, excellent questions. I'm reminded that even the Myanmar government's former Minister of Information, Uye Hut, has criticised what he's labelled the government's commission cycle for precisely that sort of tendency to set up inquiries. So it would definitely be interesting to know. And perhaps, Minister, we could start with you on the root causes of the crisis and why this crisis might be, why this inquiry might be any different. Thank you.
I was going to start with the R2P, but if you would like me to start with the root causes, that's also fine. Okay, with the R2P, my good friend, Foreign Minister Dr. Iftikhar Chowdhury, who and I worked together in the UN, very rightly pointed out that R2P was first raised around 2005 in New York. If we look at the R2P stipulation, it says R2P can be triggered if the government is unable or unwilling to look into the affairs of its own state, and if there is genocide, if there is ethnic cleansing, if there is war crimes and crimes against humanity. Well, if there are charges of genocide and ethnic cleansing, these are serious charges, and they should be proved, and they should not be bandied about lightly. This is all I need to say about ethnic cleansing. And if we are going to receive these people without any ceiling, you can send back 700,000 on a voluntary basis. We are willing to receive them. So can this be called ethnic cleansing? One. And war crimes, there is no war going on there, so basically it's not can be categorized as war crimes. Crimes against humanities, that could be a consideration, but we need clear evidence. That's why we need these investigations to come up with the evidence that crimes, war crimes or otherwise, or crimes against humanity has been committed. With regard to root causes, I mentioned that there was a security issue in Myanmar. This was because of the attack, simultaneous and vicious attacks that was carried out on 30 police stations. And this is not a light issue. What would you do if your security camps were attacked? Would you just throw back rose petals? I guess every country has the right to respond. The question is, if there has been excessive use of force, then the Myanmar military will be held to the standard that we, the government of Myanmar, holds to. We want to have rule of law in Myanmar. What I failed to mention is that the situation in Myanmar, the root causes, goes beyond security issues. It goes to the issue of human rights. It also touches upon a development crisis. Rakhine happens to be one of the poorest states in Myanmar. And because of chronic poverty and underdevelopment, lack of infrastructure, it is easy for these two communities who have had communal tensions for the past several decades to have these tensions every now and then. As a government, the government of Myanmar, if you follow what we are doing, you will find that the government of Myanmar, this government, took office in April of 2016. Within weeks, we set up a committee headed by the State Councillor Thaung herself to meet the challenge of Rakhine, because we knew very well that it could get out of hand in Rakhine. And for that reason, we have till today weekly meetings to see how the infrastructure in Rakhine can be improved, what we can do to create jobs, what we can do to improve the living standards of the people there, give them hope, give them education, give them health care. I myself have been charged at the present moment to bring investment to Rakhine. I can tell you that there are several different enterprises who are looking into investing in Rakhine. Shrimp farming, export of poultry and pigs, garment industry. We already put in 2 factories since last year. We're putting electricity in. We will have generation plants. We have just constructed in 2 months a road from Sitre to Maunder, in the direction of Maunder. Can you imagine, in 2 months we've done that, and there were no roads between Sitre and Maunder. It took several hours by boat to get from one place to the other. We're going to put in even more highways from Sitre to the heartland of Myanmar. That will change the parameters. The dynamics will change. We want to find a solution. We don't want to create problems. We will put in infrastructure. We will put in job opportunities, make it easier for people to survive and even prosper in Rakhine. What we need to do is to ensure that everybody has a stake in Rakhine. If Rakhine is prosperous, nobody is going to squabble about what religion you belong to. In Yangon, we have Muslims, Hindus, Christians, and even Jews. There are hardly any city in Asia or in the rest of the world where you have churches, synagogues, temples, pagodas within a mile radius. Today in Yangon, the Ramadan is being observed. Nothing wrong. I live in the new capital of Naypyidaw. There are several mosques. Every Friday people are saying the prayers. So why would they want to fight each other? Because they have something they can look forward to. They don't want to be at loggerheads. Last week, there was an interfaith group that went to Rakhine, headed by the Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Church in Myanmar, Cardinal Charles Bo. Perhaps, if you have a chance, please talk to him. When the Pope came, he and other religious leaders, including Hindus, Muslims, met the Pope, and they all expressed their satisfaction that, in general, there is religious freedom. But we do have rogues. Every religion, every country have extremists. So we will deal with them with the rule of law. And that brings me to the next point about why we have another investigation. My good friend Gwen posed that question. We had a national investigation headed by the Vice President. And he has a report, it's quite a thick report. I'm not sure if you have gone through it. And then we also have, on the other hand, a report from the military. Apparently, it's not satisfied the international community. So this time, we're saying, fine, we'll give you a free hand, we'll give you an investigation. And those on that board can come up with a report, and that should be the final say in this saga. Let us, once and for all, look forward instead of looking backward. We need to put development, and development. This will change the equation there. So I'm going to ask many of those private sector people present here to join hands and set up investment ventures. Make Rakhine a prosperous land. And this will have a very positive effect, not just on Myanmar, but the entire region. Look at Asia. This is the fastest growing region in the world, and we want to be part of it. There is today a deep sea port in Chaoqiu, and this is going to be linked with the hinterland in China. We have oil and gas pipelines flowing from the Indian Ocean to Yunnan and beyond. Encourage that.
Minister, I'm going to have to interrupt you just because, as always happens with these things, we now have a lot of people looking for the floor. So I very much appreciate your answers. It will, of course, look forward to hearing more details on who exactly will sit on this inquiry that will make it different. But then briefly, Peter and Jean-Christophe, before we return to the floor for the final round of questions.
Well, Iftikhar was asking whether the use of a concept like responsibility to protect was adequate in the situation, whether the situation merits the use of the concept. And let me just say that the situation certainly, in our opinion, merits deep political consideration. And that was my point this afternoon. To be very clear, we can't solve the problems which have been created in Rakhine State by throwing humanitarian assistance to the problem. With all due respect, Thaung, I would also say probably development is not the only thing with which you can solve the problem. It's a necessary conditions over time. Without a framework, a political framework which includes an accountability framework on how to deal with violations and violence in the past, it's, in our experience, very difficult comparing with other conflicts in the world to believe that durable solutions and reconciliation in society can be found. The question is the timing and sequencing of such an accountability framework and how you put the different measures together. That's not a humanitarian question, that's a deeply political question which can only be solved by an inclusive political process. In the meantime, what is urgent for us as a humanitarian actor is, and I mentioned that beforehand, is to engage with those who have been involved in the fighting over the last couple of months in order to ensure that we don't have recurrence of the same violations and violence that we have seen over the last 6 months. And that goes with a deep dialogue on the legal framework under which they were operating and possible violations of that legal framework that have happened. So we are focusing our activities clearly on changing behaviors in the present situation, but we recognize that beyond what a humanitarian organization like mine can do, a political framework, including an accountability framework over time, is of critical importance.
Yeah, in 2 words, responsibility to protect ICC, I think it's not about politics here, but about geopolitics. And we didn't get any resolution for years in New York on Syria because of one permanent member. I can guess on that file, for a reason just mentioned, the links, the gas, the petrol, the deep airborne, that one permanent member will make things difficult. We didn't get a resolution. We had to buy something, presidential statement or something like this. We were happy about it. It was better than nothing, but it was not much.
Thank you very much. We'll now the final round of questioning, and I think if that's okay, we'll just move around the table, starting with the lady in the corner. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ken. I'm from Myanmar. Thank you all the panelists and the participants for your comments. As we have seen in the past hour, the causes of the issue is complex. And in terms of effects as well, I don't think it's a standalone issue. The implications of this goes beyond the state of Rakhine. It affects diplomatic relations between Myanmar and other countries. And and therefore also affecting the humanitarian access to those affected in times of most need. In the economic arena as well, it affects investor perceptions of the country and further retards or slows down the economic progress in Myanmar. As we have seen from the tourism industry in Myanmar as well, there has been some retrenchments which affects livelihoods of people even beyond the Rakhine state. So my question is, what has been or can be done to also address the larger implications of this issue, in addition to addressing the urgent needs on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman in the corner. Yes, please, you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Ken Lin from the Myanmar Institute of Strategic and International Studies under the Foreign Ministry. At the Track 2 level, we have been discussing this Rakhine issue even before the Kofi Annan report was out. And Kofi Annan, before the Kofi Annan report, the Kofi Annan Commission also came to us for a very frank and open discussion with our think tank members. So this Track 2, at the Track 2 level, we have been discussing with the Bangladesh think tank, BIISS, and this has been sponsored by the Humanitarian Dialogue, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue from Geneva. And we have been holding these meetings at Track 2 level in Singapore. And the next round is next week. So at the Track 2 level, we're trying to solve this, exchange views on this issue. And we also have this interfaith dialogue in Myanmar, where all these four great religions are helping with this peace between the communities. So it is not a coincidence that these ASA attacks occurred just hours before, after the Kofi Annan report was, accepted by the government of Myanmar. So they don't want this Kofi Annan Commission recommendations to implement in Myanmar. They have their own agenda. They want to create violence and terror among the refugees. So you must also understand this. This is just a terrorist attack, and rejecting the Kofi Annan Commission. So I think what we're asking for is a balanced view from the international community, the media, and the UN. We don't want one-sided accusation, fake accusations based on the interviews. And some reports have come out that these interviewees have been lied in their answers. So I think you should be more careful and have a more balanced view in this matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the gentleman. Thank you.
Oh, I'm on. Thank you, Madam Chair. I find the bringing in the R2P by His Excellency, former Minister of Bangladesh, very interesting. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Pu Sotirak. I'm from Cambodia. And with relation to R2P, I am the national R2P focal point, officially appointed by my government, the only R2P focal point in ASEAN appointed to the UN 2005 World Summit that has been agreed. Now, the reason I said this is that I was also invited to visit Burma with my good friend. I also float the idea about to stop the recurring costs of which the ICRC rep talk about. There ought to be a step-by-step. R2P, it's not all about intervention all the time. State have the primary responsibility to protect civilian, But international community also have the responsibility to help state to do this work. Now, remember Cambodia have Khmer Rouge. People forget about it. 1.7 million people died harshly, and His Excellency probably know even more deeper about this, but R2P was not born then yet. But that's why the government of Cambodia buy into this R2P things. And I think it's good that if we sincere and wanted to help Myanmar government is to engage with the Myanmar government to put in place an effective civilian protection with using R2P tool. And just focus on 1 and 2, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Don't go into Pillar 3. It is a very sticky business. And I don't think states should worry too much about Pillar 3 because then the UN Security Council have to come in. It will not be easy to get UN to invoke R2P using Pillar 3. I'm looking for a way to go into Burma and try to even have a deeper discussion. I'm looking for my friend here to start talking with civil society and see if we can bring R2P into it. So I like to suggest that the panel would consider, and particularly my good friend, His Excellency Tantun, also a good friend of mine, would seriously look into this R2P as a way to help pacify some of the ill that has been happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll actually carry on along the line now before coming back to you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. My name is Thaung from the ASEAN Studies Center. I should like to follow up your question at the end of the panel discussion. What is the role of ASEAN? I think this question should be addressed to Minister Tantun. My question is, after the briefing by the new Myanmar president at the 32nd ASEAN Summit in Singapore here, has there been any new development, new decision in Naypyidaw for ASEAN to invite ASEAN to play a bigger role or to let AHA Center to do more? So that's one question. Another question is, has there been any discussion in the other sub-regional process, BIMSTEC, for example? BIMSTEC also involved Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Thailand, or even APMEC. There'll be an APMEC summit coming up in Thailand, I think this month. Can the other also come in? Since you already mentioned that Myanmar government no longer deny there is a humanitarian crisis in Rakhine State. So what can the other do to help resolve or relieve the humanitarian crisis?
Thank you very much. Time for 2 more questions for people who've had their hands up. Pan, and then 1 more from the gentleman at the back, and we are going to have to close because of instructions to finish on time. Thank you.
Thank you. As if the last round of panel is exclusively for ASEANs and Myanmar nationals. I have 2 questions. The first question is to Union Minister U Thaung. This morning, General Yakuta of Indonesia, Defense Minister, stated that IISS has been strengthening network in the border of Bangladesh and Myanmar in order to have ASEAN terrorism belt all the way towards, starting from Myanmar all the way towards Philippines. In that essence, I wonder what is the ASEAN's cooperations between ASEANs and Myanmar in order to prevent terrorism. And my second question is to all the panel members. We are a country with 2-year-old democratic government. Entire of our life, we have been living under the military dictatorships. In that essence, how can we best manage the expectation of international communities, whereby majority of the community members are expected for not necessarily overnight change, but a very swift change. But a country indeed need a transition period, so to speak, while it was transitioned from one system to another. Thank you.
You've been waiting very patiently, sir.
Thank you. I may have a different perspective from my colleagues in the audience. I may approach it from preconditions that have to exist to solve the problem of the crisis. As you may all know, it is, I think, the context of Myanmar that we have to consider. That Myanmar is in the early phases of its transition into democracy. I'm from Indonesia, It reminds me of the Indonesian transition into democracy in the early 2000s. And Myanmar has just broke away from a military authoritarian regime where the military was the government. The military was the sole holder of the political power in the country. And so were the military. So in order to familiarize themselves into the principles of democracy like R2P, like respect for human rights, which trickles down to the last soldier in the field, it requires time, one. Secondly...
I'm going to ask you if you could bring it to a question, just because there have been many very good questions and I'm going to run out of time for our panellists to answer them. Okay. So we would appreciate if you could also include your questions in the list. Thank you.
So it would be very difficult for Myanmar if the government, if there was still a divided government within Myanmar. So what Myanmar has to come up with is, I think, a coherent whole of government national policy. That may not solve the problem, but it simplifies the anatomy of the issue. So I think that's the main problem from Myanmar. That is to establish a solid single government which can provide or write down coherent national policy, one. And secondly is that my question to His Excellency Minister from Myanmar is that, does Myanmar have a vision, a long-term vision down the road into the future as to how the nation of Myanmar agrees to live in one geographical area with differences in ethnic groups, in religions? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask each panellist in the same order to do their very best to answer the questions that most interested them in a couple of minutes apiece, no more than 2 minutes apiece. So if you do pick up on the long-term vision, I'm afraid the challenge is a very short-term answer, brief answer to your long-term vision. Thank you.
We have a bevy of questions, so I would start with the last one. It's still fresh on my mind. The long-term vision. We do have a long-term vision. I'm not sure if you've heard it before. Myanmar is a young democracy, but we would like to establish a democratic federal nation in Myanmar. And the talks are ongoing, which means that we, at the moment, have 135 ethnic groups in the country, and they will all have the possibility to have their voices heard. How we will do it will depend on the negotiations that are going on. So we envisage, for now, a 7 state and divisions of the country where it will be a federal unit, and each federal unit will have autonomy in many of the decisions that they make. Of course, like in countries like India, Canada, even the United States, there will be certain decisions that will be made by the center. But that has to be negotiated. So we envisage a nation where there will be freedom of religion, where human rights will be respected, and where the democratic freedoms in other areas will be respected. So at the moment, it's a system where we have to follow a constitution which was set in 2008. And we have a system where 75% is elected and 25% of the seats in the parliament is assigned by the commander-in-chief to the military. We have said, this government has said, we would like to amend the constitution so that it becomes a democratic federal system. So that is the long-term vision that we have. If I may go on to the other questions that was posed, how to manage expectations of the international community by PAN, I think. We have in the past few years, in the past 2 years, been concentrating and focusing mainly on peace and development in Myanmar, mainly peace, because we believe that without peace and stability, there cannot be development. But in doing so, I think we may have overlooked the fact that we have not managed the expectations of the international community. We have been trying to manage the expectations of our own domestic audience, but I think you are right. In future, we will have to turn our attention to try to manage the expectations of the international community. My time is up, so I will pass on the mic to my good friend.
Well, if you have started to talk about the vision, then it's probably my role to talk about the first step of the journey. I truly believe that in the situation and the experience that we have in dealing with the humanitarian crisis in Rakhine, it is important to reconcile the different groups of the Rakhine society, and this can happen certainly partly through humanitarian work, through bringing people together, through creating conditions for return, but it needs political leadership. And the big question is, when international and national political dynamics go in a different way, when short and long-term reflections go in a different way, you can only bridge it with political leadership. So you can't do band-aid policies at the end of the day, and so the big jury out is whether there is political leadership overcoming some of those divisions.
Well, I'll be very brief. I think we don't want to rock the boat, and we hope Myanmar can complete its democratic transition. I think it is our priority, number one.
Well, thank you very much indeed to you all. As another former diplomat once said, it's not always easy, even when you share perspectives, to change people's perspectives or narratives, but some issues are simply too important to give up trying. I am very, very grateful indeed for the perspectives of the three panellists today, for the contribution from the ambassador from Thailand to Singapore, and to you all. Of course, the conversation please continue outside, but we now need to clear out. The one instruction I meant to remember, though, is please leave all of your name boards here so that they can find you tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed for your time, and a round of applause, please, for all our panellists.